Okay, we'll go ahead and get started in 10 seconds. If you can start recording, Samantha, and we'll get underway. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for NCSL's Traffic Safety Roundtable. My name is Douglas Schinkel. I am NCSL's Transportation Program Director, and I'm actually coming today live from our headquarters in Denver. One of the first times I've been in the office in a long time. I have a 3-year-old son, so doing these things from an office is a good alternative. Thanks a lot for joining us. I hope you joined us last week for our discussion of polysubstance impaired driving, which was moderated by my colleague and traffic safety partner, Samantha Block. We heard a presentation from Darren Grondell with responsibility.org giving an overview of polysubstance impaired driving. And then we deep dive into talking about oral fluid testing, hearing from Jake Nelson at AAA about that. So make sure to check that out. Samantha will post that, the link. She just put that in the chat box just now, and we will send those details in an email after the event. So today we're going to continue our discussion about drug and alcohol impaired driving. But before we do so, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. All participants will be muted during the presentations. However, we do want to encourage participation through the chat box. That is the primary way that we will be interacting with each other, and you will be giving questions to me to ask of the roundtable participants. So enter those questions in the chat box. Also feel free to answer them if you have insight, chat with your peers that are on the call. Please include your organization when you're posting your question. And please note that we will give preference to our NCSL's legislative constituents when taking questions. Today's meeting is being recorded and will be available along with copies of the presentations and a number of other resources that we will send in an email likely next week. If you experience any technical issues, please mention that in the chat box and one of my co-hosts will make sure to assist you. So very quickly, for those of you who don't know, NCSL stands for the National Conference of State Legislatures. We are a membership-based organization that supports all 50 state legislatures and the legislative staff that support the legislatures, as well as the territories. We provide bipartisan research to our members and opportunities to connect with your peers and learn what is and perhaps what is not working in your states. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but let's talk about impaired driving. So we know that of the almost 37,000 traffic fatalities on American roadways in 2018, that about 10,500 of them were impaired driving caused or related. That's 29% of the traffic fatalities in 2018, and that's kind of been the story for the last 10 or 15 years. There's been significant progress made in kind of driving down the number of impaired driving, but we're kind of stuck in this persistent level around 10,000 deaths and 30% of overall traffic fatalities every year. I think probably a lot of people know that COVID-19 has had some interesting impacts, surprising and kind of troubling impacts on traffic safety. The fatality rate, meaning the fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, went up from 1.06 to 1.25 comparing 2019 to 2020. So we know something's going on there. Some of that is excessive speed, distracted driving, but we're also seeing some data from NHTSA that collected from some trauma centers of drivers and crash victims, showing a troubling increase in the prevalence of alcohol and drugs in the blood of seriously or fatally injured drivers and other crashes, March to July 2020. So let me just read you a couple stats real quick, as they're pretty. Trauma care data showed increases in drivers with blood alcohol contents of 0.15 or more, which is, concerning. It also showed that roughly 65% of these drivers tested positive for at least one drug, which includes alcohol, compared to 50.8% before the pandemic. The study also found that 32.7% of drivers tested positive for marijuana, 28.3% tested positive for alcohol, and opioid prevalence almost doubled from around 7.5% to around 14%. Now, I want to be clear that these findings must be taken with a grain of salt. We acknowledge more research needs to be done regarding drug drivers, in part because prevalence rates cannot be used to determine impairment at the time of the crash. Nonetheless, I think these stats and kind of what we've known and, been grappling with really in legislatures for the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years reaffirms the need to discuss these state policies, enforcement, treatment, and alternate transportation options to combat impaired driving. With regards to state legislatures and how they're addressing impaired driving, in 2019, lawmakers in all 50 states considered over 500 bills related to impaired driving, with around 140 bills enacted in last year. 46 states considered over 600 impaired driving bills in 2020, but given what transpired with the pandemic and sessions being shortened and obviously putting an emphasis on COVID relief, not a lot of bills have passed. We'll have a traffic safety trends report out early next year. What happened with 2020 bills. Samantha is posting some of NCSL's online resources in there right now for you. So take a look at those. So with that, let's meet our guests and let's go straight into the speakers. I will ask the first few questions, but please be putting those questions in the chat box. Like I said, please do put your organization and Samantha will be funneling some questions to me. I first want to thank Responsible.org for helping support the meeting that we held last week. And that went really well. And that, like I said, available on the web. Their expertise and their leadership on impaired driving is really impressive, and we're proud to work with them. So thanks for their support, and let's get started by meeting our guests. So our first guest is Brandi Axtell, Senior Vice President for Responsibility Initiatives at Responsibility.org. In her role, she manages all policy, government relations, and traffic safety efforts, including relationships with Congress, state legislatures, attorneys general, governors, federal and local, state and local agencies, etc. She did begin her career at the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, where she opened MADD's first DC office. I did not know that. Very cool, Brandi. And directed advocacy efforts for the National .08 BAC law. So let's meet our next guest panelist is Edward Hutchinson. I may call him Ed, is the Strategic Policy Partnerships Manager for Roadway Safety for Lyft and serves as a law enforcement liaison for Lyft with very good reason, because he spent 20 years with the National Sheriff's Association as the traffic and officer safety director there. So he has a really unique skill set and is very knowledgeable, and looking forward to talking with him. And then last, but certainly not least, we have our friend, Representative Jonathan Singer. Jonathan Singer is a representative that represents the 11th district in Colorado, which contains the communities of Longmont, Lyons, Allens Park, and others, and is situated in northern Colorado, actually very close to where I grew up. He has ably served his constituents in the state since 2012 and is currently the chair of the Health and Human Services Committee and the Joint Technology Committee. He will be term limited in January, and we are sad about that fact. We've really appreciated having you here and being so involved in NCSL, Representative Singer. And we're looking forward to hearing once again, this is the third time he's kind of talked about his experience in Colorado and what it led to with regards to impaired driving. So looking forward to that. So without further ado, let's dive into this discussion. And like I said, please do enter questions in the chat box, and my colleagues will monitor the questions. So my first question is for Brandi, if you want to unmute Brandi, can you talk a little bit about Responsibility.org's emphasis on high-risk impaired driving and maybe what that means and why you've decided to make that kind of a focus of a lot of your work over the last couple of years?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks, Doug. In the late 90s, Responsibility.org, which was then called the Century Council, rolled out a program called the Hardcore Drunk Driver Program. And it was targeted at repeat DUI offenders and also high BAC offenders. So a couple of years ago, we assembled an expert panel. Some of the members I see are on today's webinar, including Judge Barrace. Hi, Judge Barrace. And what we did was we took a new look at this program. And we looked at what needed to be updated based on the research that had been released in previous years, and especially recently. We thought there was a better way to address this issue. First of all, we looked to that panel to rebrand this program, and everyone settled on high risk. Now, what does that mean? obviously all impaired drivers are a high risk on the roads, every single one. But there are certain offenders who are at high risk of recidivism, and they are at a higher risk of crash risk on the roads. And those people continue to be repeat offenders and high BAC drivers who are overrepresented in fatal crashes. But we also put a focus on the polysubstance impaired driver for a few reasons. Their crash risk is extremely high. People who are combining substances, whether it's alcohol and a drug or a combination of drugs, they're very, very dangerous. And in fact, some studies say 200 times more dangerous than a sober driver. So given that level of risk, we wanted to focus on that issue as well. We're also seeing that issue really emerge as a common theme in traffic fatalities and arrests, is people not even combining 2 substances, but sometimes as many as 3 to 5. And that's a huge problem that we really wanted to put a microscope on for the future. And what we also looked at is what's needed. 30 years ago, we were very focused on punishment. And what we've seen is that those repeat offenders and high BAC drivers, the percentages of their involvement in fatal crashes hasn't really declined very much. And so obviously we needed to take another look. And what we learned from our expert panel is it's really important to screen and assess these folks and then let that data drive the sentencing decisions so that you have a better chance at rehabilitation. And also to monitor those offenders. So ignition interlocks are a very important part of that, to make sure they comply with their sentences. And some out of the box ideas that haven't been tried as much in the past, like medication assisted treatment, can be helpful with some of these offenders. And it's really going to be dependent on the assessment and screening that's done. So we are really making a call for some changes to the law that would include individualized sentencing that's really gives the offender the best chance of remaining in society in a safe way and their best chance at rehabilitation.
Thank you very much, Brandi. And you hit on a lot of important things there, some of the foundational. I think a lot of that will influence the conversation we have here in terms of, making the punishment fit the crime. Also talking a little bit about the particular kind of compounding danger of when you are combining multiple substances in driving. I think Darren used that, it's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 3 or 5, and that's pretty scary. Thanks for that. Ed, I want to ask you a question. Can you maybe tell us a brief amount about Lyft's market reach so people get a sense of where it is throughout the country? Connect that with your kind of conversation about, I know there's a lot of data coming out about how ride hailing or sharing perhaps impacts, lowers impaired driving. And I'm just looking for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. First, I want to say thank you for the invitation to be here and to discuss these really important issues today. It's a pleasure to be on the stage with titans like Representatives Singer and Brandi. Always a pleasure to work with them. At Lyft, we've seen some tremendous efforts in this arena, in the research arena, in the last few years, really shoring up the law enforcement, I would say anecdotal evidence that rideshare is making an impact on alcohol and drug-related incidents. Most of us here are aware that across the nation, an estimated 30 people die every day from alcohol-related impaired driving, as you pointed out, Doug. And roughly 16% of those crashes involve drugs that are other than alcohol, as Brandi touched on as well. There are financial costs to those incidents. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration reports that impaired driving costs the United States $44 billion annually. So from around the nation, we saw little snapshots of what law enforcement were reporting. And I give you some examples. Sioux Falls reported the lowest drunk driving arrests in more than a decade after Lyft's first full year in operation there. Miami-Dade, which is the largest police department in the southeastern United States, they reported in 2018 that DUI arrests were down 65%, in part because of ride sharing. And these are their findings, not ours. Similarly, a study that was done by the UC Davis and Mall Law Group. They also found significant declines in major cities throughout California. That I want to point out that this isn't really causal, but there seems to be a correlation between rideshare entering a community and lowering those numbers of incidents. Other academic studies also align with this trend. And in one of our own annual economic surveys here at Lyft, we found that 71% of riders are less likely to drive substance impaired due to the availability of Lyft. Recently, we worked with the Traffic Law Center of the National District Attorneys Association to really take an independent look at that data that we were seeing internally, and then specifically when that rideshare enters a community, do those DUI incidents decline? The recent report that they released is on their website, and that's ndaa.org. But data were provided from a search of the crime data warehouse via business intelligence tools for incidents reported with various DUI related codes. Now, these are codes like driving under the influence of alcohol, gross vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, and driving under the influence of alcohol with injury. So it's pretty substantial evidence there. The findings this is my estimation, that I think that they were remarkable. Following the initiation of rideshare in Los Angeles, there was a 39.6% decline from the 14,774 incidents in 2013 to 8,918 incidents in 2018. In San Diego, they found that arrests decreased a total of 24.7% following the introduction of Lyft from 2013 to 2017. And then in San Francisco, the other city they looked at, DUI incidents decreased a total of 31%, and DUI bookings decreased by 31.7%. This is immediately prior to the first full year of the launch, say from 2012 to 2013 for those incidents, and bookings both increased by 65.9%. Again, this isn't causal, but definitely it's a strong correlation. And one of the things I'd point out about that study is they went actually a year before to actually look at trends. Were we riding the coattails of an already declining number of DUI incidents? And they found actually the opposite, is that there was an incline in those incidents and then a decline after Lyft came into that community. So this too equates to a lower cost for the community. I'd like to point that out. These are lost lives, catastrophic injuries, law enforcement efforts, and infrastructure damage that really communities have to pay for. There's a new report from the NDAA that will be coming out in the first quarter of 2021. And this is going to look at the cities of Atlanta, Fort Worth, and Chicago. And I would say that we look forward to those findings as well. It's probably going to be very similar. Finally, I'd like to point out a new peer-reviewed study that is compelling in the fact that it actually documents a lower crime rate when rideshare enters a community. It's the deterrent effect of ride sharing on sexual assault and investigation of situational contingencies. It's a mouthful, but I guess those are researchers, right? The authors, really what they were looking to do is examine the impacts of the availability of ride sharing on sexual crimes. But one of the additional findings in that report is that crimes in communities are generally reduced by 5% when rideshare enters that area. I think this spans the gamut and is certainly critical for communities. They argue that the availability of reliable transportation provided by ride-sharing services decreases the exposure of potential victims to likely offenders, and that's really the crux of it. This is consistent with evidence that's demonstrated in like university safe ride programs where they decrease the rate of campus sexual assaults as one example. Moreover, they argue that the impact of ride sharing on rates of sexual violence will be greater in locales with limited transportation access, and examining 377 US cities and towns from 2005 to 2017. The authors find that the availability of Uber, this wasn't even our data, it was Uber's data that was released for the FOIA Act. So they argue that this is a good proxy for the availability of rideshare in general, and it is associated with that 6% decrease in rapes. But this is actually precisely I said, I'm sorry, while this isn't exactly roadway safety, a general reduction in crime and its associated costs to a community is an important finding. And then to your last point, Doug, you had asked me about where Lyft is located. We have on our site, lyft.com, find your location to find the availability of Lyft in your community. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much, Ed. And I think the point just that, I was looking at where Lyft serves the other day and just, pleasantly surprised to see in there in like smaller cities in Montana, like Great Falls or somewhere like that. So it's not just large cities. So, and I appreciate Lyft's kind of commitment to partnering with academic institutions to look into some of the impact of ride hailing on impaired driving. It's definitely interesting because it, raises the question of, enforcement's clearly important, laws are clearly important, but providing alternatives is also important. So thank you for that, Ed. Let's turn to Representative Singer. You've been very patient. I appreciate that, Representative Singer. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Can you please tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved in this policy discussion and the resulting legislation that came from that?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you, Doug and Brandi and Ed for being there. And thanks to NCSL. This is my last year at the legislature because of term limits. And so I'm not going to fight with the state constitution on that one. But I over the years, NCSL has just been a remarkable resource and a remarkable source of really not just education, but joy for me to be able to participate in these kinds of forums. And as you can see from my background on Zoom, if you're watching, this is actually not my office, but Leslie Knope's office from Pawnee, Indiana, as a quick shout out to the folks from Indiana who didn't get a chance to host NCSL this year at their annual summit. So my thanks to the people in Indiana for being available for that. And, I guess I can't really apologize for COVID. It wasn't my fault, but I'm sorry that we can't all be together in person. So my start in this is probably pretty unlikely. My background's in social work, and I actually helped create the first drug court on a college campus to work with students that were struggling with drug use and substance dependence. And from there, I got involved politically, won my race in 2012 in Colorado to the State House. It was the same year that cannabis was legalized by the voters by an overwhelming margin, by actually about the same margin that I won by. And, I was one of only 2 lawmakers that personally supported that public ballot initiative to legalize recreational cannabis in Colorado. And so I spent a lot of my first couple of years in the state working on human services legislation, but also helping set up the first regulated cannabis regime in the nation. And what I can say about that is a couple of things, but really where it comes into play here is that I really told people in Colorado, it's not that we want to treat cannabis like it isn't a drug, but we want to make sure that we treat it like the drug it is, not the drug that some people fear it to be. And really let data be our guide, whether it's in mental health or criminal justice or social. And the point was really driven home for me a couple of years ago when, unfortunately, tragically, one of my constituents and one of my personal friends lost his stepdaughter to an impaired driver. And it was a car making a wrong kind of right turn and hit his 8-year-old stepdaughter in a crosswalk after the last day of school for her in the spring. And the reason that I bring that story up is because each time that we lose someone to a substance impaired driver, it's a preventable death. And the tragedy on top of the tragedy here just continues to compound itself in the sense that this person was under the legal limit for alcohol, under the legal limit for cannabis, but obviously, in my mind, impaired. They got less than 3 months in jail for what I consider a murder. And then you go back to the family and you think about the fact that, this is not only affecting that one individual, but her stepfather was a teacher teaching in an underserved school district in Colorado. And he couldn't teach kids anymore because he saw his daughter's face over and over again. So we lost a teacher who had to, who's worked through his own situation, has gone back to teaching. But in underserved school districts, we know we need more science teachers. He couldn't be there because our laws haven't caught up with where society is at today. So I was able to pass a bill in 2017. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed nearly unanimously that focused on gathering the right kind of data. And I'm going to put a link in the comments or in the chat section for everyone to take a look at that bill. But it started to say, okay, we know that when people are arrested for DUI, that oftentimes the drug tests stop after there's a positive BAC of 0.08 or above. Because we've got per se limits, you've got that person dead to rights, criminally speaking. What's unfortunate is we're not capturing all of the data, so we don't necessarily know whether it was an aggravating factor, that there was THC or opiates or meth or benzos or you name it in that person's system. And so we need to continue to gather those data points to be able to make the best decisions possible. And I'll just close on this, and then I'll look forward to the questions. It is really, as we're starting to get some positive data out there, I want other states to start focusing on how they can build on what our legislation did, because it wasn't perfect. But also to think about the fact that as one of the legislators that was an advocate for marijuana legalization, I also worked hard to make sure that we were not forgetting the fact that this is a drug and we need to start treating it like the drug it is. And we literally, on a more humorous note, literally had sheriff's deputies and hippies walking hand in hand on this piece of legislation going, yeah, we need to look at these data points. We need to really discuss what is causing the criminological behavior and what we can do to make sure that we're not unintentionally stigmatizing against medical cannabis users, and at the same time that we're not letting people off scot-free when they're under the influence of 2 or more substances, when they're ruining families' lives and hurting communities. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Representative Singer. I appreciate that. And we look forward to, we'll touch base back a little further in the conversation and discuss kind of what Colorado has seen since the data collection has begun. But thanks for telling that story. As oftentimes is the case with legislatures, it does start with a personal story or something coming from a constituent. So I'm sorry that had to be a sad situation, but hopefully some good things are going to come from it. I want to ask a question of Brandi and Ed, given that we have so many people on this call from legislatures, but from different associations, from state DOTs, that may be looking to partner and take advantage of some of the resources that groups such as responsibility.org and Lyft have. Maybe if you can give me a quick sense of maybe some of the key partnerships and initiatives that you both have that work with, particularly with state governments. Doesn't have to be state governments, but if you could give me just a quick example or two each, and Brandi, why don't you go first?
Sure, happy to. One of the things that we really love to do at responsibility.org is find those promising programs, many of which are at the state or local level, and work with them to provide some experience and evidence base. And so some of those partnerships that we have engaged in, we have one with the Colorado Department of Transportation. We've worked with them for the last 3 years on trying to educate people on how alcohol affects their BAC. The current project actually takes people who have been on Interlock and are coming off of Interlock and aims to give them a breathalyzer that they could use to understand what their BAC limits are and to see if that helps them to keep from recidivating, because so many people, when they come off the Interlock, do start to drive impaired again. So that's one example of a program. We have partnered with the Governor's Highway Safety Association for the last 6 years to provide state grants to state highway safety offices to train law enforcement on the signs of how to detect impaired driving, specifically polysubstance and drug impaired driving. So that is one example. We have worked with a number of courts. Judge Barace's court is one in Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania. but also others on piloting a screening and assessment tool that identifies substance use and mental health problems. And we actually are now partnering with Colorado to use that tool with all felony DUI offenders. And I believe Louisiana, I see Catherine Childers on here. Louisiana is starting to use that tool with all of their DWI courts. So that's just a snapshot, but we probably have 10 or 15 programs that we've done with states and localities. And I welcome anyone who wants to tell us about their program and try to partner. We love to do that.
Thank you, Brandi. I appreciate that. And Ed, can you tell us a little bit about how Lyft partners with state and local governments?
Sure. So at Lyft, we have actually 2 different tiers of departments that interact with state and local agencies. More frequently, the local teams actually work with those agencies to implement roadway safety projects. And that's just because they know the terrain, they know the players, all of that, to address impaired driving at that local level. Some examples is the North Dakota State Highway Safety Office. It's actually working with the local teams to implement a longer-term annual impaired driving campaign using Lyft as an alternative to impaired driving. And you were talking about reaching those areas that are actually difficult to reach. We partnered with them at the federal level a couple of years ago through the Governor's Highway Safety Association, and they had a grant for $20,000 to address impaired driving during the holiday period. And they enjoyed that so much that they wanted to actually implement a longer-term project. I handled the federal team. The local team is handling this new project with them. In the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Maryland area, the Washington Regional Alcohol Program utilizes Lyft credits for its Sober Ride program. And actually, since partnering with Lyft in 2017, RAP's annual Sober Ride ridership has nearly tripled, with about 4,500 total riders for 2019 versus 1,655 in 2016, which was the last year when the Sober Ride program was serviced by participating taxi cabs, and targets the 21 to 35 age demographic. I should probably point that out as well. We just all know that that's the really difficult group to make inroads with in that particular demographic. In Colorado, the State Highway Safety Office partners with Lyft locally and implements its 320 program. This is a plan a ride before you're high with 106 online stories from that effort last year. They had about 18,968,156 impressions and a $1.46 million value added to that through that project. It received a printed story. It had 67,520 impressions from television, offered another 59 stories. There were 5.4 million impressions and about a $519,000 earned media value. And social media offered another 132 mentions and 1.6 million impressions. So this is a high return on investment with a total of about $2 million in value for very little input into that campaign. The campaign last year had about 3,800 discount codes that people actually utilized across Canada just for that project. And then again, I run the federal projects at the federal level. Lyft is actually partners with the Governor's Highway Safety Association. We've got 5 projects in the works right now with 5 different states where we give them $20,000 to provide ride codes and to support their campaign. These are unencumbered funds, so they can use those a little bit more creatively. They can use DOT monies really to address impaired driving during the holidays. We also partner with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the National Sheriff's Association, and the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, really centered all around both roadway safety, specifically around impaired driving, and how we can assist them in those efforts.
Thank you for that, Ed. I appreciate it. Let's take a question or two from the audience. There's one question that I think Representative Singer and Brandi will probably be able to speak to. It is from Renee Gibson. Hello, Renee, with the American Traffic Safety Services Association. Thanks for joining us. The question is kind of along the lines of your discussion, Representative Singer, and goes nicely into the question we want to discuss about collecting data. So what are the challenges with collecting the data points you mentioned? I've heard there's difficulty in detecting marijuana and impaired driving incidents. Is that true? And maybe I'll leave it there and start with that. So Representative Singer, maybe if you want to go first, and I'm guessing Brandi maybe has some insight as well.
Yeah, no, and people can watch the chat for what I've been responding to as well. And yeah, Amy, I appreciate the questions, and it does I agree with you on everything that you're saying. And what I would say is that there is a lack of scientific data. And oh, good, I'm glad to see Glenn Davis with our State Department of Transportation and Public Safety is there as well, answering. This is where I'm going to go with this. And this kind of goes back to what NCSL's role is, a couple of years ago, there was a resolution passed at NCSL calling for the descheduling of cannabis, taking it off, or at least taking it off of Schedule 1. And the lack of scientific research that is really quality research, when I say that, meaning actually taking cannabis samples that are actually used by consumers as opposed to what National Institute of Drug Abuse grows itself, and really looking at what driving behavior is, would be a huge help to get representative samples. What I'll say, and Glenn can talk a little bit about this too, if what our Department of Transportation has done, and I would recommend that other states take this up as well, is interfacing directly with members of the medical cannabis community and recreational cannabis community to say, okay, we all agree that impaired driving is wrong. We may have different impressions of what impaired driving is and what creates that impaired driver. And so there have been these anonymous hold harmless tests that are done where people will drive in a driving simulator after abstaining from cannabis use for 24 hours, imbibe, get a designated driver or a Lyft, and then do that same driving test again and look at their behavior. And we're starting to collect data on that, but also informing that driver of, you tell me you're a safer driver when you do this. Let's look at what would actually get you pulled over. And I think that's where we need to go as states, is really interfacing with people where they're at. And I'll go into that in probably another question, but I'll leave it at that and let Brandi see if Brandi has any other follow-ups.
Yeah, I would love to dovetail on that. One of the reasons it's difficult to detect marijuana is the amount of time that it takes to take a person, go get a search warrant, because you're going to have to get blood for evidence purposes. So by the time you do that and you take them to a hospital, or you take them to the station for that blood test, a good 90 minutes, sometimes even 2 hours have passed. So the problem with marijuana or cannabis specifically is it exits the body much faster than the impairment dissipates. And so the test result does not reflect the impairment. So there's a couple of ways that states can look at this in terms of making this a better process. Number one, electronic search warrants. Many states are setting up electronic search warrants, which actually in Minnesota decrease the number of errors on their forms, but that enables a law enforcement officer to secure a search warrant within minutes sometimes. So that's one thing. Another thing is oral fluid testing. Oral fluid testing at the roadside, it's been used for evidential purposes once in California, but it's normally used at the roadside. And that can help a law enforcement officer determine what drugs are in that person's system. It shows presence, so obviously it would need to be part of a DRE examination and a thorough investigation, but it does help the law enforcement officer who's not trained in DRE or A-RIDE to understand the presence of drugs and what is in that person's system. So that's another thing. We've made some progress in a number of states. I think there's about 10 states that use what's called law enforcement phlebotomy. So actually, Arizona was the first state to do this probably more than 25 years ago. More recently, Washington, Idaho, and a number of other states have implemented this. In Washington state, they train their law enforcement officers through the Department of Health. Once they're trained, they are basically lab technicians, and they can moonlight as lab technicians as they want to. But what that enables the law enforcement officer to do is, when they're trained as for law enforcement phlebotomists, they can take that blood at the roadside or even down at the station. And that's going to be a much faster way, which also helps out, particularly in times of COVID, when you might have to take someone to the hospital, which takes even longer and costs even more money. Blood tests are expensive. There's a number of different barriers, and we talk a lot about that in some resources that we have released that are always free to the public. I'm happy to send some of those links to you.
Thank you, Brandi. I appreciate it. And I think this just demonstrates that this is just not as simple to address in many fashions as alcohol impaired driving, particularly when you're talking about multiple substances. So there's some great questions coming here. Let's do another question from the audience. I think that perhaps Representative Singer and Brandi, you might have some thoughts on this as well. This is from Chuck Hayes. He's with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Thank you for joining us, Chuck. There continue to be some states that have difficulties passing legislation to change their DUI statute to include any impairing substance. In the West, there are a number of states trying to do that, and may need some assistance with that. Any suggestions? I would say, first of all, Chuck, feel free to contact me and we can share some resources with you. But I think kind of connecting with your peers here is obviously one good way to do it, but I imagine you're maybe looking for things a little more concrete. So I want to see Brandi or Representative Singer, maybe one of you want to take a first stab at that? Raise hand if you want to go first. Brandi, how about you go first? I'm guessing you maybe have some ideas.
I'm happy to go first. I think that one of the things that we can offer is providing assistance to the states. And there are a number of different groups that are working on this issue. Last week, Darren announced on the webinar that responsibility.org will be forming and launching a coalition called the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving. And really its purpose is to help states, both from an advocacy and a program perspective, to really dig into how to make it easier to combat drug and polysubstance impaired driving. So please know that we're there. National Safety Council is very active and very good on this issue. There are a number of different partners that do engage in advocacy efforts, and we would love to be helpful to you. But there are a number of laws. I'll send around a state checklist that we have put together that could be a good resource. Doug, if it's okay with you, I'll send you some of those links for the follow-up. But there's a number of different things, and the states are really going to have to look at how to deal with this new problem. And it's going to require some changes to the laws, particularly, first and foremost, making it illegal to drive with multiple substances in your system, or even other substances than alcohol. It's something we're seeing everywhere, and that's a major update that the states need to undertake.
Thank you for answering that. So just real quickly, out here on the West, and I'm with the DEC program. So
Chuck, I'm sorry, we're not in a situation where we can allow for
okay,
and have that free of a discussion, because that would quickly get difficult. So I would just encourage you to connect with Brandi elsewhere after the event. Sorry for that. Representative Singer, do you have anything to add on that? I'm not expecting you necessarily to, but
yeah, well, I mean, I think the question was a little bit more of a political strategy question. Sorry. Yeah, I think it was a political strategy question more than anything else. And so this is the quick thing I'll do, because I know we're butting up against the 2 o'clock here, is I think it depends on your state. But one of the things that I've tried to do is really thread the needle and engage people where they're at. Law enforcement, district attorneys were all frustrated because what we were seeing was a situation where people were not getting arrested and being let off the hook when they were obviously impaired. And that's what they were, this is what law enforcement was frustrated with. Medical patients, on the flip side, were upset because they were saying, well, we're being targeted. People see me come out of a dispensary and they just assume I'm impaired, and I get pulled over, and all of a sudden I've got a criminal record. And so, I met people with sort of their worst fears and said, well, what do you really want to have? And we split the difference. And when I sort of joked to say that we had hippies and cops, walking hand in hand, my haircut might betray this now, but, I consider myself a hippie. But I've also, as a child protection worker in a previous career, worked very closely with law enforcement. And I think building those coalitions, regardless of where you're at, Colorado, when we passed this law, we had a Republican Senate and a Democratic House and a moderate governor. Those are the kinds of things that seem to get things further in Colorado. I can only assume that they work well in other places where you find bipartisan ways of splitting the difference, and no one showed up to testify against the bill. And so I think that's the leaping off point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that, Representative Singer. Yeah, clearly a lot of political strategy that goes in all of that. So thanks for giving us a little bit of window into that. Got a couple interesting questions and comments. Ed, sounded like the idea of just the data you presented concerning the impacts of ride hailing on impaired driving. Got one suggestion from the Oregon Department of Transportation motorcycle safety program. It's nice to see them part of this discussion. Kind of asking, but also just encouraging Lyft to include motorcycle riders kind of specifically in their marketing for those kind of free ride type initiatives that you do, especially since motorcyclists tend to be overrepresented in the amount of impaired driving crashes. So that's kind of an interesting. And then there's kind of a question along those same lines, Ed. Really compelling that this is from Joe Livingston with NHTSA. Thanks, Joe, for joining us. Really compelling data on Lyft regarding corresponding decrease in impairment-related crashes and citations. Do you have any data on the impact of rideshare coupons, free rides in terms of, does this lead to additional reductions? I'm guessing you may not know that information, but also how many of those free rides are actually being used? And anything you can maybe share there, Ed.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the reference to the Governor's Highway Safety Association's grants that we give out. So we really actually let the State Highway Safety Office design that program. Who do they include? Do they want to target market that grant down to really micro levels in their communities? They can certainly do that. They also do a great job of collecting the data. So we rely on them to give us a report out at the end of that term, for example, of where that data came from and how they collected it. Now, as far as are these ride codes utilized, I don't think anyone has ever not utilized something for free. The states actually design how and to what frequency they use those codes. So they can be anywhere from $10 to $20. I guess that would be the ballpark for those rides. And they're used at particular times of day. Sometimes it's 6 o'clock until 3 o'clock 6 o'clock in the evening until 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, Saturday, Sundays, those kinds of things. Before the holidays, Christmas, New Year's, that kind of thing. And they tend to get used up. I don't think anyone's ever turned in any ride credits to us to date. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that does. I appreciate that. Ed. I want to ask a question. I want to get to a couple other questions. Brandi, I feel like we should maybe at least talk a little bit about that bill that was enacted in California, signed by the governor fairly recently. I'm forgetting the bill. No, I'm not forgetting the bill number because I have a note. Assembly Bill 3234. Can you tell us a little bit about what transpired with that bill and perhaps what some of the unintended consequences of that are? Because I think that's instructive for the audience.
Sure. In California this year, there was a successful attempt to expand a pilot program into a permanent program. And that is a diversion program for misdemeanor offenders. And in the pilot program, it had exempted a number of crimes, including DUI. So In the pilot program, DUI was not eligible for this diversion and then expungement. However, in the passage of the law this year, it does allow for misdemeanor offenses, including DUI, to be expunged from a person's record after they have successfully completed a diversion program. Now, diversion programs are a tricky thing. There are ways to do them in a good way, and there are ways to do them poorly. Oregon, I think, is one of the best examples of a diversion program where a person can successfully complete their sentence, and though it stays on the record for law enforcement and criminal justice purposes, for employment purposes, it does not. So that is, if your state is looking at a diversion program, that's the better way of doing it. The unintended consequence of the California program is that DUIs are going to be expunged from the record. And when a person recidivates, which is roughly about a third of first offenders will recidivate, they are not going to come up as repeat offenders. And that's a problem because repeat offenders, they need a different toolkit. We know that they don't, they are not able to stop drinking and driving or using substances and driving. And a different set of actions needs to be taken with them. And so if you have those people kind of falling through the cracks, it's going to be a big issue. So we're hopeful that the legislature will go back and correct that to exempt DUI cases. But it's something we're going to be working on in California next year.
I really appreciate you weighing in on that, Brandi. I thought that was important to highlight that. Representative Singer, I'm thinking, are there other things you want to add about now that Colorado has been collecting this data for a couple of years? Do you want to share a little bit more about what's going on? I know some of your partners with the Colorado Department of Transportation and what have you are on the conversation, but is there anything else you want to share about how that's gone, some of the challenges, some of the numbers you're seeing?
Sure. I mean, I think, I always try to think about key takeaways that I want people to get. And so I'll just repeat one thing that was already said. We need more drug recognition experts on the roads there that are able to detect substances other than alcohol. I think that is, most people on all sides of this issue would agree with that. In terms of some numbers coming out of Colorado, I would say that, one of the bigger ones that we've seen recently is we've got high school students between 2017 and 2019. The number of high school students that drove after recently using marijuana went from 9% to 11%. And during that same time frame, high school students who drove after using alcohol stayed about the same, 5.6% to 5.9%. There's one other sort of key data point that I'll share, and then and I'll tell you why this is important. The percentages of drivers testing positive for Delta-9 THC, which is the intoxicating component of cannabis, fatal crashes increased from 18% to 23% from 2016 to 2019. And the percentage of fatalities with drivers who tested positive for the impairing substance increased from 20 to 25% in that same time frame. So the question to me is, well, what are we doing to have conversations with folks about why they're doing this? Because I don't want to just catch people and arrest them and throw them in jail, because the situation will continue to perpetuate itself. And this was the striking, and I put a link in the chats already with some of these data points, but 13% of drivers who consume cannabis reported driving all of the time over the speed limit on neighborhood roads. 3% of drivers who don't use the drug report driving all the time over the speed limit on neighborhood roads. And so the question is, well, why? What is this difference that's going on? And this is where CDOT and Department of Public Health in Colorado have done a great job of really sitting down and doing the qualitative research with cannabis users and cannabis patients to say, well, what is it that works? What is it that doesn't work when we talk about this stuff? And, really using incorrect terminology, calling it weed, calling it pot, putting it in pejorative terms, people tune out of that message, especially cannabis patients and people who use cannabis recreationally. And so if we're not using the right language to communicate this, we're not creating the correct public relations or public health response. So I want other states to think about that and really work with people who are in that cannabis community to say, well, if this message isn't working, what is the message that does work?
That was great. Thank you so much, Representative Singer. I think it's interesting with the marijuana impaired driving that some of the maybe stereotypes or impressions are maybe proving to be wrong. We don't know maybe enough yet data-wise, but what I will say is that, you know, when you look at, say, the AAA Traffic Safety Culture Index or some of the surveys that that CDOT and other Colorado agencies have done, that there seems to be, you know, people know for the most part that alcohol impaired driving is a bad idea. There still is a little more kind of tolerance or thinking that maybe it's okay. And so that's something that clearly has to be kind of addressed. And the point you made too, Representative Singer, makes a lot of sense. And I know Colorado has adjusted here in that, you know, treating these people like adults and not using these kind of Cheeto jokes and things like that, but trying to really engage people and see what they're thinking, because it is legal now and we're just gonna have to deal with that environment, whether people like it or not. So it's, you know, it complicates things for sure, but that's kind of where we are. I want to ask, you know, Brandi, I want to return to you because I think there's one more thing I feel like we should at least spend 1 minute on, is that we have an upcoming, well, at some point we will have a new federal reauthorization of our Transportation Act, the FAST Act. And there's certainly some potentiality for new components to be added in or for things to be refined in the FAST Act. And I wanted to get a sense, you know, a lot of people, when they think about the FAST Act, they think about the funding aspect of it, but here there's a lot of traffic safety programs. Can you talk about what you think, how you think that might change, and maybe one priority that responsibility.org has for the FAST Act reauthorization?
Sure. You know, one of the things I've learned in the almost 30 years I've been working in this field is that the states really know their problems better than the feds do. And so, I mean, I think that to some degree, what I would love to see, I don't know that it will happen, is greater flexibility for the states to address their local problems. And so often when we work on this at the federal level, it's usually 10 or 15 groups that are weighing in, and they all have different priorities, and it all gets carved up like a pie. So, you know, this group will get one thing, this group will get one thing, and the states are left to kind of make something out of that. And I think the FAST Act is a great example of a whole bunch of incentive grant programs that the states have not been able to take advantage of. So some more flexibility is key, and that doesn't mean that there's no accountability. The accountability is I think comes part and parcel with that flexibility, and I think the states would be fine with that. But one of the things that I think the bill really has to focus on is polysubstance impaired driving. You know, drunk driving is still very much a problem. Drug impaired driving is a problem, but polysubstance impaired driving is not currently in the federal transportation bill. And that, you know, it takes about 2 years to get one of these bills passed. The bill's usually 5 years. So we really need to be thinking about where this issue is going to be in 7 years and where we need to put some funding and some focus. The other thing I'll just mention really quickly is alcohol detection technology. So that's another thing that's been underway for about the last decade. There's a program called the Driver Alcohol Detection System for Safety, or also DADS. And they're working to develop a car. NHTSA is funding it, Virginia, Maryland are funding it, and also the auto industry. And it would create a technology that wouldn't allow the car to start if you were at the 0.08 BAC level. And so that's a technology that we would like to see continued to be funded. It's supposed to be ready by 2025, and it would be touch-based and breath-based. And what I'm told is that the touch-based system holds some promise for being able to detect drugs as well. And there is a study coming out, I think early in the new year, out of the Volpe Center, and it's doing a scan of all of the types of technologies that have promise, DADS, but also anything else that might be out there along that realm. But that's, you know, that's a big piece too. If you can make it so their cars can't start, that would be great. And then people know that they need to take an alternate way home, like rideshare. So, but anyway, there's lots of things I could go on forever, but those are two.
Thank you so much, Brandi. I thought that was important to touch on. Yeah, states obviously eagerly await for the funding aspect, but the traffic safety programs to see what the next federal reauthorization looks like. Thanks for the mention of dads. I think that's important. People understand that technology, and that's, perhaps closer than we think it is. We are out of time. I want to acknowledge Representative Singer, Brandi, Ed. You all went above and beyond. I don't think I've ever seen speakers who have been so good at using the chat box to include resources. So we will collect all those resources from the chat box, along with this recording, along with a number of other NCSL resources and some other things that we put together. And we will send that in an email probably next week that will also include a link to our discussion from last week. So I want to thank you all again for being here. This is certainly not the last time we will talk about polysubstance impaired driving. Our hope is that I will see some, if not all of you in person next year. We are still tentatively planning on holding our legislative summit in Chicago in early August. Don't hold me to the word that will happen for sure, but there's a decent chance of it. And if there is, then we having traffic safety programming there. We will very likely have a traffic safety pre-conference at that meeting. So we'd be hopeful that many of you could join us there. So more word on that to come. But in the meantime, let's give a virtual round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you
for the opportunity.
Singer, for your time working with NCSL. Brandi, thanks so much for the support of responsibility.org and being such a leader in this, and Ed for sharing all the great information. And have a happy holidays, and we will talk to you and see you all next year, and be in touch in the meantime. So